Type is saying things to us all the time. Typefaces express a mood, an atmosphere. They give words a certain coloring.
Everywhere you look, you see typefaces. But there's probably one you see more than any other one, and that's Helvetica. You know, there it is, and it sort of just seems to come from nowhere. You know, it seems like air, it seems like gravity.
And it's hard to evaluate it. It's like being asked what you think about off-white paint. It's just there, and it's hard to get your head around something that's that big.
And most people who use Helvetica use it because it's ubiquitous. It's like going to McDonald's instead of thinking about food, because it's there, it's on every street corner, so let's eat crap because it's on the corner.
For me, Helvetica is just this beautiful, timeless thing. And certain things shouldn't be messed with, you know?
Graphic design is the communication framework through which these messages about what the world is now and what we should aspire to, it's the way they reach us. The designer has an enormous responsibility. Those are the people, you know, putting their wires into our heads.
Now, should I talk? Should I not talk? I mean, you want to say something? Say something, say nothing. Life of a designer is a life of fight. Fight against the ugliness. Just like a doctor fights against disease. For us, a visual disease is what we have around, and what we try to do is to cure it somehow, you know, with design. Good typographer always had sensitivity about the distance between letters. We think typography is black and white. Typography is really white, you know, it's not even black. It is the space between the blacks that really makes it. In a sense, it's like music. It's not the notes, it's the space you put between the notes that makes the music. For instance, we designed the corporate identity for American Airlines. This is done in 1966. And the novelty at the time was the fact of making one word instead of two American Airlines, by making American Airlines all one word, half red and half blue, just separated by the color. And what could be more American than red and blue? You know, so it's perfect. It's the only airline in the last 40 years that has not changed their identity. All the airlines come and go and they change it. American Airlines still the same, and there's no need to change. And how they can improve it? They got the best already, you know. American Airlines in Helvetica. We always had the tendency to use very few typefaces. It's not that we don't believe on type. We believe that there are not that many good typefaces, you know. If I want to be really generous, it's a dozen. Basically, I use no more than 3. There are people that think that the type should be expressive. They have a different point of view from mine. I don't think type should be expressive at all. I mean, I can write the word dog with any typeface, and it doesn't have to look like a dog, you know. But there are people that, when they write dog, it should bark, you know. What Helvetica is a typeface that was generated by a desire of having a better legibility. It is a modern type. It is a very clear type. It's good for everything, pretty much. You can say, I love you in Helvetica, and you can say it with Helvetica extra light if you want to be really fancy, or you can say it with the extra bold if it's really intensive and passionate, you know, and it might work. You can also say, I hate you, you know. I can write, you know, I certainly can write few letters in Helvetica and saying that, you know, to Washington in particular, if I can put it that way. When Helvetica came about, we were all ready for it. It just had all the right connotation that we were looking for anything that had to spell out loud and clear, modern.
The 1950s is an interesting period in the development of graphic design. In that post-war period, after the horror and the cataclysm of the Second World War, there's a real feeling of idealism among some designers, many perhaps, across the world, certainly in Europe, that design is part of that need to rebuild, to reconstruct, to make things more open, make them run more smoothly, be more democratic. There was this real sense of social responsibility among designers. And this is the period when the early experiments of the high modernist period start to be broken down, rationalized, codified. You get the emergence of this so-called international typographic style, or Swiss style. And it's Swiss designers in the 1950s who are really driving that along. This is where Helvetica comes in. Helvetica emerges in that period in 1957, where there's felt to be a need for rational typefaces, which can be applied to all kinds of contemporary information, whether it's sign systems or corporate identity, and present those visual expressions of the modern world to the public in an intelligible, legible way. So it's underpinned, is what I'm saying, by this great feeling shared by many designers of idealism.
I'm a modernist, you know. I was trained in that period. I lived in that period. I love modernism. I go next week to London to see the exhibition of modernism. I want it, you know, well, that's my life. I'm surrounded with furniture from that period, and I can't change myself anymore. But if I see today designers, they use all typefaces and through each other. One day one typeface, the other day the other typeface, all in favor of a certain atmosphere. I don't like that. I'm always interested in clarity. It should be clear, it should be readable, it should be straightforward. So I started using gradually grids for my design, for my catalogs for museums. I invented the grid, and within the grid I played my game, but always along the lines of the grid, so that there is a certain order in it. That's why I used grids. That's why they called me Gridnik. For me, it's a tool of creating order. And creating order is typography. I started late with the computer. I think it was 1993 that I bought my first computer, and I learned myself, and I can handle it now quite well, but not like the young people. I'm slow with it, and I can do it, but I'm very much interested, and I would have liked to have in the 60s the computer, because we can speed up our work, we can do it so much better, and especially all the layers that you can bring into your work. We had the greatest problem in the 60s to bring 2 or 3 layers into work. You need to do it by photograph, you did it all kinds of crazy techniques. And working on a poster took us days. And now, within half an hour, you have your ideas and you can make variations and make a good choice. You can do better design with a computer, but you can speed up your work enormously. Shall I begin? Sure. I made these post stamps on the style movement. In the beginning, if you see the sketches, I tried to use typefaces from Van Doesburg, one of the artists of the style movement. Then I decided for the final designs not to use this typeface because the illustration is already from the period, and I used the most neutral typeface, Helvetica. The Helvetica was a real step from the 19th century typeface. It was a little more machined. It was doing away with these manual details in it. And we were impressed by that because it was more neutral. And neutralism was a word that we loved, you know. It should be neutral. It shouldn't have a meaning in itself. It should, the meaning is in the content of the text and not in the typeface. And that's why we loved Helvetica very much.
I have to say that for a lot of my life, I rather dreaded the moment of having to explain to someone, you know, you find yourself sitting next to some nice person on a plane or a train and they ask you sooner or later what you do. And if you say type designer, they generally look completely blank. Occasionally someone will actually know the term, but then will say, I thought they were all dead. Since I did some work for Microsoft in the mid-90s on screen fonts, particularly Verdana and Georgia, I've had quite comical encounters with people who will say, oh, you work with fonts. We just got this memo around the office. We've all got to start using something called Verdana. Have you ever heard of it or something or other? You know, it's funny conversations that never would have happened to me, you know, 30, 40 years ago. My dad was a typographer. And although he didn't push me to follow in his footsteps, when I left school, high school in the UK, I had a year to fill before going to university, and I got sent as a trainee, unpaid trainee intern, to a type foundry in the Netherlands, where I spent a year learning what turned out to be a completely obsolete trade of making type by hand. It was a matter of cutting letters in steel, engraving them at actual size. You know, I doubt if I ever got up quite to one letter a day at that time. So, you know, I could say that really I've made type by practically all the means it's ever been made in 51 years that I've been working. It's hard to generalize about the way type designers work. There really isn't a generality of us, but I think that most type designers, if they were sitting in this chair, would essentially start in much the same way. I would probably start with a lowercase h. It tells me, first of all, whether this is a sans serif or a serif typeface. If it were a serif face, it would look like this. Here are the serifs, so-called, these little feet on the bottom and the top of the principal strokes of the letter. Are they heavy? Are they light? What is the nature of the serif? Is there a lot of thick-thin contrast in the letter form? What are the proportions of the overall height, the ascender, so-called, of the H and the X height part of it, the lower part of it? Then, because an H is a straight-sided letter, I would then do a round letter, like an O, alongside it. I can get a sense of how the weight of the curved part of the O relates to the weight of the straight part of the H. And already, there is a huge amount of DNA in just a couple of letter forms like that. I would then probably do something like a lowercase p because it's half straight and half round, and also it has a descending stroke, which is another vertical dimension that I would be interested in establishing. I would then build on that. If you've got an H, you've got an awful lot of information about M, N, and U in the lowercase. If you've got a P, you've got Q and B and D and so on. And then just as soon as possible, I would get them into words or something that looked like words Because for me, the experience of reading something is so critical in judging it as a typeface. Because I find that that's the acid test, really, of how a typeface performs. One of the most characteristic and, to my mind, beautiful things about Helvetica is these horizontal terminals you see in the lowercase a and c and e and g. The whole structure is based on this horizontal slicing off of the terminals. It's very hard for a designer to look at these characters and say, how would I improve them? How would I make them any different? They just seem to be exactly right. I'm glad no one ever asked me to second guess Helvetica, because I wouldn't know what to do. This is the original type specimen of Helvetica. Before it was Helvetica, it had its original name, the Neue Haase Grotesk. The whole story of how Helvetica came into being is not entirely clear, at least to me. It is said, and I think it's true, that Eduard Hoffmann, who had been the boss at the Haas type foundry, wished to make a modernized version of Accidents Grotesk, which was essentially a traditional 19th century German sans serif. And his method of doing that was to sort of clean it up and so on. And it was, of course, Max Miedinger who made the drawings for Helvetica. I received the impression from people I knew back in the 60s and 70s that Hoffmann's part in this was a very much more significant one than you might just assume by reading in a textbook that Max Miedinger was the designer of Helvetica.
You can easily say this was a joint product of both Miedinger and my father. Miedinger couldn't produce a typeface alone. Neither could my father. But when both were working hard together, then something good resulted. Here are the first trials of Neue Haase Grotesk, which was the first name of Helvetica.
I knew the way things worked at Haas, and I had gradually picked up on the importance of Eduard Hoffmann and his almost pathological shyness, and the way that he would use other people's hands. But boy, could you see his mind at work on the faces where he was deeply involved.
You have here a note by Eduard Hoffmann indicating all the desired corrections. The capital Y is too slim. Capital A is also too slim.
When you talk about the design of the Haas Neue Grotesk or Helvetica, what it's all about is the interrelationship of the negative shape, the figure-ground relationship, the shapes between characters and within characters, with the black, if you like, with the inked surface. And the Swiss pay more attention to the background, so that the counters and the space between characters just hold the letters. I mean, you can't imagine anything moving. It is so firm. It's not a letter that's bent to shape. It's a letter that lives in a powerful matrix of surrounding space. It's brilliant when it's done well.
My father had clear ideas how the typeface should look like. So my father and Miedinger sat together and he started drawing. Here you have a proof of an alphabet with observations by Max Miedinger.
When Miedinger worked for Haas, he did not work as a designer. he was actually a salesman. His job was to travel around Switzerland taking orders for fonts of type.
By profession, he was a graphic artist, but he realized that he could make more money in selling foundry type. But my father said, if ever I have an idea of a new typeface, I'm sure that you could design it. I have here a specimen, type specimen book of both type foundries, Stempel and Haas. You have to know that Haas was controlled by the German type foundry Stempel, and in turn, Stempel was also controlled by Linotype.
Now we go down to the cellar and see in our archives where we can find Helvetica. And here we have number 24. And there it is, woo, the Helvetica drawings.
The marketing director at Stempel had the idea to give it a better name because Neue Haas Grotesque didn't sound very good for a typeface that was intended to be sold in the United States.
Stempel suggested the name of Helvetia. This is very important. Helvetia is the Latin name of Switzerland. My father said, it's impossible. You cannot call a typeface after the name of a country. So he said, why don't we call it Helvetica? So in other words, this would be the Swiss typeface. And they agreed.
And I think Helvetica was a perfect name at that time. And the Swiss typography at that time also was well known worldwide. So it was the best solution for Helvetica to get into the market.
Once we'd introduced Helvetica, it really ran away. It was exactly what the designers were looking for. I mean, I don't think there's been such a hot thing since as the figure-ground relationship properly executed. And it was, just a landslide waiting to go down the mountain, you know, and away it went.
I imagine there was a time when it just felt so good to take something that was old and dusty and homemade and crappy looking and replace it with Helvetica. It just must have felt like you were scraping the crud off of like filthy old things and kind of restoring them to shining beauty. And in fact, corporate identity in the 60s, that's what it sort of consisted of. You know, clients would come in and they'd have like, piles of goofy old brochures from the 50s that had like shapes on them and like goofy bad photographs. They'd have some letterhead that would say amalgamated widget on the top and some goofy, maybe a script typeface above amalgamated widget would have like an engraving showing their headquarters in Paducah, Iowa with smokestacks belching smoke, And then you'd go to a corporate identity consultant circa 1965, 1966, and they would take that and lay it here and say, here's your current stationery and all it implies. And this is what we're proposing. And next to that, next to the belching smokestack and the nuptial script and the ivory paper, they'd have a crisp, bright white piece of paper. And instead of amalgamated widget, founded 1857, it just would say Widgeco in Helvetica medium. you imagine how bracing and thrilling that was? That must have seemed like you would crawl through a desert with your mouth just caked with filthy dust, and then someone's offering you a clear, refreshing, distilled, icy glass of water to kind of clear away all this horrible kind of like burden of history. It must have just been fantastic, and you know it must have been fantastic because it was done over and over and over again. So this is what I'm talking about. This is Life magazine, 1953. One ad after another in here. It just kind of shows every single visual bad habit that was like endemic in those days. You've got, zany hand lettering everywhere, just swash typography to kind of signify elegance, exclamation points, exclamation points, exclamation points. Cursive wedding invitation typography down here reading, almost everyone appreciates the best. This was everywhere in the 50s. This is how everything looked in the 50s. You cut to, this is after Helvetica was in full swing, same product. No people, no smiling fakery, just a beautiful big glass of ice cold Coke. The slogan underneath, it's the real thing, period. Coke, period. In Helvetica, period. Any questions? Of course not. Drink Coke, period. Simple.
Governments and corporations love Helvetica because, on one hand, it makes them seem neutral and efficient, but also it's the smoothness of the letters makes them seem almost human. That is a quality they all want to convey because, of course, they have the image they're always fighting that they are authoritarian, they're bureaucratic, you lose yourself in them, they're oppressive. So instead, by using Helvetica, they can come off seeming more accessible, transparent, and accountable, which are all the buzzwords for what corporations and governments are supposed to be today. Now, they don't have to be accessible or accountable or transparent, but they can look that way. Our tax forms from the IRS are in Helvetica. The EPA uses it. Now there's someone who wants to look clean and official and efficient.
Designers, and I think even readers, invest so much of the surroundings in the typeface. American Apparel uses Helvetica and it looks cheeky, and American Airlines uses it and it looks sober. And it's not just a matter of the weight they choose and the letter spacing and the colors. There's something about the typeface that I think really invites this sort of open interpretation. You can say that typefaces are either those that are fully open to interpretation or merely have one association attached to them. A typeface made of bicycles or candy canes or something just says one thing, and Helvetica maybe says everything, and that's perhaps part of its appeal. I mean, typography has this real poverty of terms to describe things beyond, X height and cap height and weight and so on. I find that when Tobias and I are working on projects together, we tend to use a lot of qualitative terms that are entirely subjective. Working on the typeface for Esquire years ago, I remember my saying, no, this has that like Saturn V rocket early NASA quality. It needs to have that orange plastic Olivetti typewriter Roman holiday espresso feeling. And I know you got exactly what I was saying, but it was, but it's that there's really no way to describe the qualitative parts of typeface without resorting to things that are fully outside it. And we're constantly saying, this has that it feels kind of Eric Satie. It needs to be Debussy. Or this has a kind of belt and suspenders look. It needs to be, much more elegant, hand-lasted shoe.
I've been collecting these signs for a couple of years now, and one of my favorites is these signs. I have a number of these. This is what the street signs in New York City used to look like. This actually functions so much more clearly and so much more effectively than what we see out on the street now. The sort of classical modernist sort of line on how aware a reader should be of a typeface is that they should be aware of it at all. It should be this crystal goblet, there to just hold and display and organize the information. But I don't think it's really quite as simple as that. I mean, I think even if they're not consciously aware of the typeface they're reading, they'll certainly be affected by it. The same way that an actor that's miscast in a role will affect someone's experience of a movie or play that they're watching. They'll still follow the plot, but be less convinced or affected. I think the typography is similar to that. Where a designer choosing typefaces is essentially a casting director.
There's very little type in my world outside of work. Like everybody else, I'm aware of the fonts being used in my environment, and the standing joke that graphic designers can't see historical movies because the fonts are always wrong is certainly true.
It definitely makes the world outside the office very different. My fiance and I were trying to remember the location of a restaurant in our neighborhood, and she remembered it as that new place that's just a couple blocks down from the dry cleaner. I remembered it as that new place just a couple blocks down from the place with the bad letter spacing out front.
Nobody doesn't know what Helvetica is. I mean, at the beginning of our careers, certainly before everybody had a PC or a Mac, no one knew what fonts were. I think even then people might have known what Helvetica was. The fact that it's been so heavily licensed and made available through these very populist technologies has kind of furthered the mythology that it's the ultimate typeface in some way. And even, I think, for us professionals, that's hard to escape from. I sort of find myself buying into the idea that, oh, the sans serif evolved for 100 years, and the ultimate expression of it was Helvetica. And realizing sort of, wait a minute, that's not quite true historically or aesthetically or culturally or politically, but there's something about it that does have the feeling of finality to it. This is the conclusion of one line of reasoning was this typeface, and perhaps everything after it is secondary in some way.
Hello. Hi.
I'm obviously a typomaniac, which is an incurable, if not mortal disease. I can't explain it. I just like looking at type. I just get a total kick out of it. They are my friends, Other people look at bottles of wine or whatever, or girls' bottoms. I get kicks out of looking at type. It's a little worrying, I must admit, but it's a very nerdish thing to do. I'm very much a word person, so that's why typography for me is the obvious extension. It just makes my words visible. Real typeface needs rhythm, needs contrast. It comes from handwriting, and that's why I can read your handwriting, you can read mine, and I'm sure our handwriting is miles away from Helvetica or anything that would be considered legible, but we can read it because there's a rhythm to it, there's a contrast to it. Helvetica hasn't got any of that.
Why, 50 years later, is it still so popular?
I don't know. Why is bad taste ubiquitous? No, it's actually, Helvetica was a good typeface at the time. It really answered the demand, but now it's become one of those defaults that, partly because of the proliferation of the computer, which is now 20 years, the PC, I mean, You know, it was the default on the Apple Macintosh, and then it became the default on Windows, which copied everything that Apple did, as you know, the interface and everything else. And then they did the clone version, Arial, which is worse than Helvetica, but fills the same purpose. I think now it's never going to go away because it is ubiquitous. It's a default. It's air. You know, it's just there. I mean, there's no choice. You have to breathe, so you have to use Helvetica. It brings a style with it. Every typeface does. It has a certain, well, it's like a person, you know. If you're slightly heavy in the middle, you're not going to walk around in tight t-shirts. You look an idiot. And Helvetica is heavy in the middle, so it has it needs certain space around. It needs a lot of white space. It needs very carefully to be looked at the weight gradations. It needs a lot of space sideways also. Then it's very legible, but very small and very tightly done and very lightly as model designers. It's a nightmare. It's a total nightmare. I wouldn't say this if I hadn't tried it. You know, but because all the letters, it's the whole Swiss ideology. The guy who designed it tried to make all the letters look the same. Hello, you know, that's called an army. That's not people. It's people having the same fucking helmet on. Doesn't further individuals. And the aim with type design is always to make it individual enough so that it's interesting. But of course, 95% of any alphabet has to look like the other alphabet. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to read it. I've never sort of woken up with a typeface coming on. You know, like some people, gotta do this, and they have to, you know, go to their, whatever, their easel, and, you know, these amazing brush strokes. I don't have that urge, you know. I wake up and I usually want to go on back to sleep. I mean, everybody puts their history into their work. And I certainly know that when I draw something, it has, I'm fast, I'm loud, I'm chaotic, I'm not very rule-based, even though I'm German, and I love rules, but I'm way too chaotic. I'm a Gemini, it was my birthday yesterday, so I'm all over the place, essentially. I'm always on time, but I'm always, but a year late, you know what I mean? So it's, but then I'm on the second, so I have this horrible thing in it, which comes out of my typefaces. They are never perfect. They always have a little edge in the sense that I leave them alone when I get bored with them. I know there's people who hate me who would never use one of my typefaces in a million years, and vice versa. People would use any typeface I design, not because it's good for them or it fills the purpose, simply because I did it. And I think we all do that. I mean, you know, certain bands I buy every CD from, even some of them are crap, but I buy them because I've always bought their CDs or their music. Why do people buy certain things? The brand rubs off on them. And typefaces are a brand. You're telling an audience this is for you by using a certain typographic voice. You know, you would recognize a Marlboro brand 2 miles away because they use a typeface that they only use. You can buy it, I have it. Anybody can, it's called Neo Contact, anybody can buy it, but Marlboro have made their typeface theirs. You can recognize any Marlboro ad from miles away because of that stupid typeface. If they use Helvetica, hello, it wouldn't quite work.
The way something is presented will define the way you react to it. So you can take the same message and present it in 3 different typefaces. The response to that, the immediate emotional response, will be different. And the choice of typeface is the prime weapon, if you want, in that communication. And I say weapon largely because these days with commercial marketing and advertising, the way the message is dressed is going to define our reaction to that message in the advertising. So if it says buy these jeans and it's a grunge font, you would expect it to be some kind of ripped jeans or to be sold in some kind of underground clothing store. If you see that same message in Helvetica, you know it's probably on sale at Gap. It's going to be clean, that you're going to fit in, you're not going to stand out.
All of us, I would suggest, are prompted in subliminal ways. Maybe the feeling you have when you see a particular typographic choices used on a piece of packaging is just, I like the look of that, that feels good, that's my kind of product. But that's the type casting its secret spell.
In a way, the Helvetica is a club. It's a mark of membership. It's a badge that says we're part of modern society. We share the same ideals. It's well-rounded. It's not going to be damaging or dangerous.
Helvetica has almost like a perfect balance of push and pull in its letters. And that perfect balance sort of is saying to us, well, it's not sort of, it is saying to us, don't worry. Any of the problems you're having, or the problems in the world, or problems getting through the subway, or finding a bathroom, it's all those problems aren't going to spill over. They'll be contained. And in fact, maybe they don't even exist.
What I like is if this very serious typeface tells you the do's and don'ts of street life, and it must be Helvetica at that moment. The image of Helvetica as the corporate typeface made it so-called the typeface of capitalism, which I would actually reject and say it's the typeface of socialism, because it is available all over, and it's inviting dilettantes and amateurs and everybody to do typography, to create their own type design. And I think that's it's a good thing. I think I'm right calling Helvetica the perfume of the city. It is just something we don't notice usually, but we would miss very much if it wouldn't be there. I think it's quite amazing that a typeface can advance to such a status in our life.
As is always the case with any style, there's a law of diminishing returns. The more you see it, the more the public sees it, the more the designer uses those typographic and graphic solutions, the more familiar, predictable, and ultimately dull they become.
By the time I started as a designer, it sort of seemed there was only one trick in town, which is like, what could you use instead of Helvetica? You know, ABH, anything but Helvetica. And you do need lots of sans serif typefaces, but it seemed like Helvetica had just been used so much and overused so much and associated with so many kind of big faceless things that it had lost all its capacity, even to my eyes at least, to look nice.
And by the 70s, especially in America, you start to get a reaction against what it seems to those designers is the conformity, the kind of dull blanket of sameness that this way of design is imposing on the world. So something that had come out of idealism has by this time become merely routine, and there's a need for a change.
You come into design at the point that you start out in history without knowing you're starting out in history, and very often you don't have a sense of what came before you and how it got there, and you certainly don't know what's going to come after. And when I walked into design as a student at Tyler School of Art, what struck me was sort of two separate cultures of design. One was the corporate culture. And the corporate culture was the visual language of big corporations, and at that time, they were persuasively Helvetica. And they looked alike. They looked a little fascistic to me. They were clean. It reminded me of cleaning up your room. I felt like this was some conspiracy of my mother's to make me keep the house clean. You know, that all my messy room adolescent rebellion was coming back at me in this form of Helvetica, and I had to overthrow it.
Hey, I got some printouts of the stuff from last night.
I also was morally opposed to Helvetica because I viewed the big corporations that were, slathered in Helvetica as, sponsors of the Vietnam War. So therefore, if you used Helvetica, it meant that you were in favor of the Vietnam War, so how could you use it?
Wow.
What looked cool to me at that point were record album covers, zigzag rolling papers, sort of the accoutrements of dope life and counterculture, obviously underground newspapers and magazines, and Pushpin Studios. Pushpin Studios was the height of, at the time I was in college, everybody's ambition to work there, to do work that was as inspiring as their work, because it seemed fresh and alive and witty and content-laden, aside from the fact that Seymour, Quast, and Milton Glaser could really draw. And I wanted to make work that looked like that. When I was at Tyler, I wanted to be an illustrator, and I had a teacher named Stanislaw Zagorski, and I never knew quite what to do with the typography on my designs. We would make book covers or record covers of school projects, and I would go to the local art store and go to Sam Flack's, and I'd buy Helvetica as press type, and I'd rub it down on the corner of the album the way I thought it was supposed to be, kind of flush left. And of course, it would never line up properly, and the thing would crackle and break and really be terrible. And Zagorski told me to let go of the press type and illustrate the type. And it hadn't dawned on me that typography could have personality the way drawing did. I realized that type had spirit and could convey mood, and that it could be your own medium, that it was its own palette, a broad palette to express all kinds of things. So I painted this cover for the AIGA Annual, and the title of the AIGA Annual was Graphic Design USA, and I decided that I would take the title literally and sort of analyze what Graphic Design USA was. So I decided what I do is I list every state in the United States and the percentage of people who used Helvetica. And I didn't have any scientific evidence of knowing what percentage of people in each state used Helvetica, so I decided to base it on the last Reagan election, and so that the states that went for Reagan all had more than 50% of the people who used Helvetica.
If Helvetica was the typeface of the Vietnam War, what's the typeface of this war?
The Iraqi War?
Yeah.
Helvetica. Same time period. I mean, it's the same, it repeated. That's why we're there. Helvetica caused it.
And so in the postmodern period, designers were breaking things up. They wanted to get away from the orderly, clean, smooth surface of design, the horrible slickness of it all as they saw it, and produce something that had vitality.
I myself got fairly disappointed with modernism in general. It simply became boring. If I see a brochure now with lots of white space that has, like 6 lines of Helvetica up on the top and a little, sort of like abstract logo on the bottom and a picture of a businessman walking somewhere, the overall communication that says to me is, do not read me, because I will bore the shit out of you. Not just visually, but also in content, because the content will likely say the same as it says to me visually. I was in terrible rock bands when I was 15, 16, 17, and I think through that experience, got close to the album cover, and essentially I went to art school because of album covers. I probably was the last generation that got taught doing everything by hand. So, we drew, 10-point type with a brush. In general, I was always fairly bored in, looking at type books and deciding over and over again which type to pick for a certain project. It just didn't seem a very interesting task to do. So here and there, I think with the records, with the CD covers, we started to do our own type. And I think there was one instance, it was for a Lou Reed cover, where this hand-drawn typography resonated. And numerous projects came out in that vein, in all sorts of directions, in a more funny direction and in a more serious direction. Where at one time our intern carved a hand type into my skin for a lecture poster. The type, in an instant, in a single image, tells the story of its making, tells you about its process in a very elegant way, in a very fast way. That typography strangely became so well known, just within the design community, of course, that some people thought that that's all we do, which thankfully is not the case. Well, I always thought that that approach of people using only 3 or 4 typefaces, very suspect. I think this could be interesting to do for a single project as an exercise to put up additional limitations in order to focus yourself. But as a strategy over a lifetime, I think it's akin to a writer saying, I'm only gonna write in 3 or 4 words. Yes, you probably could do it, but for one, why would you? And for the second, would it really yield an interesting body of work over a lifetime?
Designers wanted to express their subjectivity, their own feelings about the world, their sense that they had something to say through design, through the design choices they make. And of course, this caused controversy. If you take a figure like Massimo Vignelli, who'd been one of the 60s high priests with his company Unimark, it's right there in the name, Unimark, the idea of a uniform kind of expression. When he looked at this new work, this expressive, subjective, wayward, to his way of thinking, irrational new way of designing, it seemed like the barbarians were not only at the gate, but they'd stormed through and they'd taken over.
In the 70s, the young generation was after psychedelic type, and all the junk that you can find. And also in the 80s, with their mind completely confused by that disease that was called postmodernism, the people were just going around like chicken without their heads by using all kinds of typefaces that could come around that could says not modern, in a sense. They didn't know what they were caring for. They only knew about what they were against, and what they were against was Helvetica.
I have no formal training in the field. In my case, I never learned all the things I wasn't supposed to do. I just did what made sense to me. I was just experimenting, really. So when people started getting really upset, I didn't really understand why. I didn't say, well, what's the big deal? What are you talking about? And it was many years later that somebody explained to me, probably better than I can explain it now, is that basically there was this group that spent a lot of time trying to organize things and get some kind of system going, and they saw me as coming in and throwing that out the window, which I might have done, but it wasn't the starting point, and it wasn't the plan. And only much later did I learn terms modernism and this and that. And Ray Gun magazine was very much experimental. It was completely experimental. Every issue would try a lot of things, and a lot of them worked and a lot of them didn't work. I never saw proof, so a lot of times there were just mistakes, flat out mistakes, that people would write long essays on why I did this black type on a black boot or something. And no, I never saw proof. What are you talking about? It's very hard to do the more subjective, interpretive stuff well. You know, I can teach anybody off the street how to design a reasonable business card, newsletter, but if I bring the same group off the street in and play a CD and say, okay, now let's interpret that music for a cover, well, 9 out of 10 people are going to be lost and are going to do something really corny and expected, and one person is going to do something amazing because that music spoke to them and it sent them in some direction that nobody else could go. And that's the area to me where it gets more interesting and exciting and more emotional, and that's where the best work comes from. This is an article on the singer Brian Ferry, and when I read the article, it was very much like so many of these others I'd read. It's like, oh man, you know, how disappointing, how boring. And I went through all my fonts, which at the time would have been hundreds and hundreds, well, still is for that matter, and didn't find one that seemed to fit my kind of disgust and boredom with this article. And I finally came to the bottom. There was Dingbat. Of course, now I read Zap Dingbat, so literally the last one. And then it was like, well, it's boring. It's not worth reading. Why not do it in Zap Dingbat? That's a font. So it's all set. In Dingbat, it is the actual font. You could highlight it and make it Helvetica or something, and you'd be able to read it, but it really wouldn't be worthwhile. It's not very well written. Don't confuse legibility with communication, and just because something's legible doesn't mean it communicates. And more importantly, doesn't mean it communicates the right thing. And vice versa. Something by being maybe difficult to initially read may be sending a completely different message that is valid for where it's being used, and that may require a little more time or the involvement of the reader. But it almost seems stronger the other way. If something is a very important message and it's said in a boring, nondescript way, then the message can be lost. I mean, that doesn't say caffeinated. It's just like, hello? Why not? It's just sitting there. There's nothing caffeinated about it. There's nothing extramarital about that. There's no sunshine here. That's no fun. That's not a fun sand lot. Where's the explosion? This could be the first date. This might be close. These buses are kind of boring, but it's a very thin line between simple and clean and powerful, and simple and clean and boring.
That was sort of the rise of what's referred to as kind of grunge typography. That became a all-consuming aesthetic for about 2, 3, 4, 5 years, as that trend worked its way down from the masters who originated it to anyone who sort of already had a tendency to make mistakes and all of a sudden found that they looked good now instead of incompetent, which is the way they looked the day before.
Typography was so broken by the end of the grunge period, just lying there in a twisted heap, all rules cast aside, no apparent way forward, that all those designers could perhaps do by the late 90s was to go back, to return to an earlier way of designing, but with a new set of theories to support it.
For us, modernism does have a more subversive side. I think that whole image of modernism as something that is primarily concerned with functionalism, utilitarianism. That is something that emerged much later. That was more a late modernist thing or something. I think the early modernist movements, like Dadaism, Futurism, Surrealism, that sort of things, all had their more subversive sides and their more, how do you call it? The more dialectical sides that it went against something. It's not that we are against that experimentation that people such as David Carson and Amy Gray and Fuse, that Nefer Brody did. We think what we do is a sort of extension of that. All that hunting to the next typeface every time, it took a lot of energy. And I can still remember as students that you were really disappointed because you wanted to use a certain typeface and then you saw somebody else used it and then you couldn't use it because you wanted to be original. And with Helvetica, this whole problem is non-existent because everybody is using Helvetica. A lot of people see the way that a young generation of designers use a typeface such as Helvetica as a more superficial way, as a sort of appropriation of a style. I think we would very much disagree with that. I think all three of us grew up in the 70s in the Netherlands, which was dominated by the last moment of late modernism. For example, the city I was born and grew up, Rotterdam, that logotype was designed by Wim Krauwel. The stamps were designed by Krauwel. The telephone book was designed by Krauwel. The atlas that you use at school was designed by Krauwel. So for us, it is almost like a sort of natural mother tongue. That's something really natural. It's not that we... I mean, a lot of people think you sort of study it from books and then copy it or something. But I would really say that it's almost in our blood. It's also funny because a lot of people connect Helvetica sometimes with the sort of dangers of globalization and standardization. I'm not afraid for that quality at all because I just know that everybody can put their own twist on it. I think you can put as much nationality in the spacing of a typeface as in the typeface itself or something. And I think the way people like Krauwel use Helvetica is typically Dutch, I think. And that's why I'm never really impressed by the sort of argument that Helvetica is this sort of global monster.
I'm not one of those people who is a real typographer. I don't know all the fancy words for all the letters and, all the sort of, ligatures and ascenders and descenders and all that kind of thing. I'm just more sort of, just react to certain things and just do, what I feel is right with them. So I'm never really sort of, classical sort of, type guy. So I get obsessed about things, I collect things. I've got so many bits of shrapnel paper of, things that, you find on the street or, wrappers, and it's just making something beautiful out of something very ordinary. And that's what I kind of really enjoy, is the ordinary things that most people would just gloss over, you know, I find really beautiful. The biggest thing for me in terms of design is to get a sort of emotional response from a piece. That's some of the best design, I think. I see stuff, and to me, if it makes me go, I wish I'd done that, that for me is like the biggest thing, you know, or, you know, you just get this real, like, you know, like, ooh, you know, kind of an inner kind of like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah, sure.
For me, it's all about that emotional response. One of the things I've always really wanted to design is airplane signage, you know, sort of an identity for an airline. I'd love to do like uniforms or, you know, sort of seats and, you know, the whole thing, you know, trucks and, you know, that kind of thing. I just think would be brilliant, you know, just sort of, you know, I've done these little 12-inch sleeves for long. I want to go a little bit bigger scale now, you know. It's that idea that something's designed to stand the test of time. Hopefully some of the things that I've designed will be still being used, you know, in 20, 30 years. I'd love to think that. I got married about 3 years ago. I did the wedding invites, which, believe me, is just the worst job you could ever do as a graphic designer, but I've done other people's wedding invites and I will never do one again. It's the most stressful job I've ever had. Dealing with mother-in-laws, you know, is just horrific. But yeah, I did ours. And on the order of service, I did a little credit to give thanks to Max Meidinger for Helvetica. But my wife vetoed that and I had to take it off the invite. But yeah, it was funny. I think I fell in the sort of step of Helvetica when I was at Dior. I always really enjoy using Helvetica because some people say, you know, they use a different typeface because it has this, gives a different feeling. And I really enjoy the challenge of sort of making Helvetica speak in a different way. You know, it's been around, you know, 50 years coming up. It's just as fresh as it was, you know, and obviously it wasn't intended to be, you know, this cool thing, but it's just a beautiful font.
Well, okay. We are less obsessed with Helvetica than we used to be.
Yeah, we was really obsessed from Helvetica, but not more so much.
We accepted somehow. We came to a point where we accepted that it's just there.
We like restrictions. We can't operate, we can't do nothing without restrictions. And the more restrictions we have, the more happy we are.
When we started school, the influences in graphic design was really like Brody and Carson. It's only after that We really we looked at Josef Müller-Brockmann's work and 60s Swiss typography. When we started the office, we really said we wanted to look more back and to find more structured design. For us, it's very important to reduce the elements we use. When it comes to type, we will only use, if possible, one typeface, or like two, and if possible, we will use one size. We don't like humanistic typefaces, for example. We like a little bit, it must be more rational, because otherwise they have too much expression. We think that Helvetica contains somehow a design program. It will lead you to a certain language also. And this is also one of the secrets of the success of Helvetica, that in itself it is already, it has a certain style and a certain aesthetic that you will just use it like that, you know, because of the typeface, because the typeface wants it like that. You will do what the typeface wants you to do. If you are not a good designer, or if you are not a designer, just use Helvetica bold in one size, like for a flyer, or it looks good.
So it may very well be that when it comes to trends, at least in graphic design, we've reached sort of, the end of history. And the pendulum that swings back and forth doesn't have any more directions it can swing in. The final trend may simply be the completely democratic distribution of the means of production to anyone who wants it or anyone who can afford it.
You can have a music studio for a couple of $1,000. You can have a film studio for 10 grand. You definitely can be a designer with $1,000 or $2,000 and have basically similar tools than the people who do this for a living.
If all these people have the tools to make good design, they realize that it ain't that easy. You know, it's not just opening a template in CorelDRAW or in PowerPoint.
You know, it's not about having the latest version of whatever program. If you don't have the eye, if you don't have a sense of design, the program's not going to give it to you.
I remember years ago, a friend of mine who produced radio commercials had 5 guys go out in the hallway of CBS Records and sing the beginning of Round, Round, Get Around, I Get Around by the Beach Boys. And they really tried. They rehearsed for a week to get their harmonies right. And they were the best vocalists who worked in that department on that floor, and they loved music, and they went out and they sang it. And of course they were totally flat and it sounded terrible. But they had rehearsed, and then of course the voiceover for the Career commercial said, now you can appreciate the Beach Boys. And it's really sort of the same thing. I mean, the closer you come to it, and the more you see it, the more you can appreciate it when it's terrific.
There are more good young type designers, by young I mean probably late 20s, early 30s now, than at any time in history. So who knows what typefaces they will design in terms of style and so on, but they'll be good. And, to my way of thinking, that is a huge gain, a huge benefit that comes with this more democratic, more accessible technology.
There's just something about Helvetica, something about the fact that people keep saying, I've come up with an improvement of Helvetica, and it never is really good. You know, I wonder whether or not somehow there's some whole undiscovered science of typography that sort of would say that it's not just because we're used to seeing it, it's not just because it was associated with all these things that we consider authoritative, but it somehow has this kind of inherent rightness. You know, the rightness of the way the lowercase a meets the curve, the rightness of the way the G has a thing that comes down, the rightness of the way the C strokes are like that instead of like that. You know, I mean, I wouldn't have believed that those things actually could be right or wrong as opposed to someone's taste. Yet you sort of have nearly 50 years of history of the thing just sitting there daring people to fix it. And it seems to be unfixable.
It's always changing. Time is changing. The appreciation of typefaces is changing very much. Why you grab a certain typeface for a certain job has a different meaning than we grabbed a typeface in the 50s for a certain job. You are always a child of your time, and you cannot step out of that.
What we have is a climate now in which the very idea of visual communication and graphic design, if we still want to call it that, is accepted by many more people. They get it, they understand it. They're starting to see graphic communication as an expression of their own identity. And the classic case of this is the social networking programs such as MySpace, where you can customize your profile. You can change the background, you can put pictures in, you can change the typeface to anything you want. And those choices, those decisions you make become expressions of who you are. You start to care about it in the way that you care about the clothing you're wearing as an expression of who you are, or your haircut, or whatever, or how you decorate your apartment. All of those things. You know, we accept the idea of identity being expressed in that way through these consumer choices. Well, now it's happening in the sphere of visual communication. And there's no reason, as the tools become ever more sophisticated, why this just won't go on developing and developing and developing.